Hello and welcome to the latest dose of science news from New Scientist. I'm Penny Sarche and I'm joined today by Rowan Hooper.
Hello.
This week we've got quite an amazing story of a new kind of brain implant that's made out of brain cells, which, to use the journalistic cliche, it might sound like science fiction. It's not, but we will also be talking about actual science fiction, as we're going to be hearing from our resident culture critic, Bethan Ackley, on the best science fiction TV and film of the year.
Hurrah.
We're going to start, though, with a special report on Antarctica. Sometimes climate change news, it can all be a bit drip, blurs into one, just overwhelming and depressing. And it can be hard to tease out those stories that really, you have to sit up and listen to, really. But this is one of those. Our Australia reporter, James Woodford, he's been in Hobart, Tasmania, with nearly 500 researchers for a conference that was billed as an emergency summit for the future of the Antarctic. Rowan caught up with him to hear all about it.
James, I want to hear about the general vibe at the meeting. But first, there was one statistic that really captured everyone's attention there. And for you were saying this captured the seriousness of the entire climate crisis.
Yeah, thanks, Rowan. Look, the mood at the conference, at the summit, was definitely somber. And at times, just everybody just trying to make sense of the enormous changes that are taking place down in the Antarctic. And normally statistics can make people feel pretty sleepy. So bear with me on this one. As many listeners will be aware, there was a precipitous drop-off in the extent of the winter sea ice around Antarctica in 2023 and again in 2024. 2024 was nearly as bad as 2023. And in 2023, there was 1.55 million square kilometres below the expected average extent of sea ice, which was the lowest recorded since satellite data. That's, just to give some context, that's an area 6 times the size of the United Kingdom. It's just an enormous area. I think everyone was pretty alarmed by that, but now researchers have calculated just how incredibly dramatic that collapse in sea ice actually was. Neroli Abram from the Australian National University, she told the summit this was 7 standard deviations off the mean for what the extent of sea ice should have been. This means we're not talking about a 1 in 10 year event or a 1 in 100 year flood. This was an event that models would have predicted could only occur somewhere between 1 in 7.5 million years to 1 in 700 billion years.
All right. So basically impossible on a planet that's only 5 billion years old. Well, what does that mean? That's an incredible number. It's obviously an outlier, but is there a mistake there? How do they explain that?
Exactly. Obviously, that kind of a number is impossible. And really what it's a product of is that no one could have foreseen that Antarctic sea ice would have dropped off a cliff in the way that it has. Abrams says that in just a decade, the decrease in the Antarctic is equivalent to that lost in the entire Northern Hemisphere in the past 45 years. Even more alarming is the projection that Antarctica could possibly experience summers that are essentially free of sea ice before even the Arctic, which is projected to reach that point sometime before 2050.
Wow, I think we're up in the Northern Hemisphere here. We're much more aware of the problems in the Arctic. And a phrase I often use is what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. In other words, if we lose the summer sea ice in the Arctic, it has these huge knock-on effects. And so I take it it's the same in the Antarctic.
Yeah, exactly. As we're starting to learn with the Northern Hemisphere, with some of the changes in the ocean currents, some of the very similar things are starting to take place in the Antarctic. And I wish I could just say to you that this drop-off in sea ice in the Antarctic was only of academic interest. But unfortunately, that would be a white lie. And I'm sorry, no pun intended. In fact, researchers are now scrambling to try to understand what the implications of this are. Firstly, they want to know whether this is a new normal for Antarctic sea ice. And the consensus at the conference, like every scientist that I spoke to after Abram's presentation, said that it is unlikely that sea ice extent will return to what it was before it began to fall in 2016. But it also has these huge global scale climate and ecological consequences. For a start, having that much less ice is going to lead to much more heat being absorbed by the ocean just because it's not reflecting the sunlight back into space. And it also changes the salinity of the Southern Ocean. But perhaps the biggest worry is that the sea ice acts like a protective barrier or apron around the entire continent that stops the ice shelves on the Antarctic coastline from being buffeted by waves and exposed to more of these warm currents.
Right, so it would accelerate the ice cap itself. Did they talk about that at the conference?
Yes, they did, Rowan. There was a gripping presentation from Sharon Thompson at the University of Tasmania. She spent last summer camped on the Denman-Shackleton ice system with her team, and they were drilling through 200 meters of ice shelf to reach the ocean underneath. And her results show that for the first time, that warmer, modified circumpolar deep water is getting into the cavity under the ice shelf. And at the point where their drill hole was located, the underside of the shelf seems to be melting at a rate of about 2 meters per year. Again, wow. That might sound academic, but if the Denman-Shackleton ice shelf melts, that's 1.5 meters of global sea level rise just on its own.
Wow. So how are people taking this there? I mean, these are kind of these people, they're climate scientists, glaciologists, they're well aware of the problem, but was it shocking even for them?
Yes, they were really shocked by the presentations of their colleagues. And some of them said to me that after the drop-off in sea ice in 2023, that they just kind of hoped that 2024 things would bounce back. And they're definitely not confident that we're going to see any kind of a return to previous levels of Antarctic sea ice. And a summary that really has stayed with me since the conference was from Ed Doddridge, who's also from the University of Tasmania. And he summed up the disaster unfolding with just one word, and that was grim.
Okay, I thought you might say a swear word, but grim. Yeah, it is grim. James, thanks very much for reporting that.
Great. Thanks very much for having me, Ron.
Yeah, we were hearing there on a little bit about the work of Sharon Robinson. She is from the University of Tasmania. James met with her, and she was talking about the melting and all the warming going on. And while she was waiting for a flight to Antarctica, I got in touch with her and asked her to tell us a bit more about her work, and here she is.
One of the most challenging things working in East Antarctica is that we think the most significant changes are actually happening in one of the places that's most difficult to measure. And that's underneath the ice shelves, where the ice is being melted by the warmer ocean water. We know from other regions that ice shelves act a little bit like dams. If they start to weaken or break up, then ice from the continent can flow more quickly into the ocean, contributing further to sea level rise. As a whole, the region that we're currently working on holds a potential 1.5 metres in sea level rise contribution, but we don't really have a very good understanding about the rate of change or the timescales over which it might happen.
Wow, imagine working on the melting of the underside of the ice sheet.
Yeah, I know. I asked her what it's like doing that, actually, and also what it's like being a climate scientist in this period of crisis. And also I wanted to get a flavour of what it's just like being there, and that's your day job. For us stuck in offices here, what's it like? And here she is.
Being able to work in this field and make a contribution, however small, to our understanding of these systems in Antarctica is such a unique opportunity. Being able to better predict the impact that they might have on our future is something that makes me hopeful. I think the more we understand, the better placed we are to face future challenges and to start to mitigate some of the changes that we see. Antarctica is an amazing and challenging environment to regularly work in, and there are moments every now and then, especially when you're out on an ice shelf for weeks at a time, and you look up and the realization of where you are and just how incredible that is hits you all over again. But I think for me, one of the really remarkable aspects of working somewhere like Antarctica is the diversity of amazing people that it attracts, all with different skills and experiences. And that's often what makes working in this kind of environment so unique.
Well, it almost makes you want to be a polar biologist. It does sound amazing. But what about the ecology of the region? What do we know about how much that's likely to change?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. Something I wondered about. So I hunted down another biologist, a climate change biologist, Sharon Robinson from the University of Wollongong. And she specialises in the Antarctic, been there loads of times. And this is what she said to that.
As ice retreats with global heating, areas of land are exposed and vegetation can expand and colonise these new areas. So in some areas, especially on the Antarctic Peninsula, we can see clear evidence of newly green areas. But Antarctica is essentially a desert. There isn't much snow and it hardly ever rains. Plants grow really slowly, about 1 to 3 millimetres a year in the case of the mosses. Most of the vegetation relies on the snow and ice banks to melt and provide a steady stream of water through the summer. In some areas, those snow and ice banks are disappearing or losing connectivity with the vegetation. And then we see previously gloriously green areas turning grey as they dry out. Seeing lush green areas that you've seen in the past turn grey is really sad. I really worry that we will lose some of Antarctica's rich biodiversity, like these ancient moss forests, along with the tiny animals like tardigrades or moss pignuts that live within them. Off the coast, we're losing sea ice at alarming rates. This can be catastrophic for the animals like emperor penguins that breed on the ice, and for the tiny animals on the seabed below that rely on the shade from sea ice to keep the algae from overgrowing them.
So that was good to hear tardigrades get a shout out there.
Old New Scientist favourite there, yeah.
Definitely.
It's interesting that the continent, it's sometimes greening, but at other times when the ice is gone, you also lose the green areas. And she mentioned there the threat to emperor penguins. There was a mass breeding failure last year for some of those because of the loss of sea ice.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's why it's an emergency summit. It's very precarious out there.
For our next story, we're exploring an extraordinary breakthrough in the development of brain-computer interfaces. This is a device made of living neurons that has been implanted into the brains of living mice. And Jeremy Sue is here to tell us about it. Hi, Jeremy.
Hello.
First, why are they doing this kind of experiment?
So yeah, we can maybe first take a step back and just start considering why companies are developing brain implant devices in the first place. If you have a device that can read activity from certain brain regions or even ideally individual neurons, then that could allow the brain implant recipient to potentially control a touchscreen tablet or smartphone, or maybe even control a robotic arm, just by mentally thinking about doing certain actions. So that could be really helpful for example, for people who are living with paralysis because of a stroke or neurological disease. And if your device can also use electrical signals to really stimulate those certain brain regions, then you could even potentially activate those brain regions in ways that could be really helpful in treating or circumventing certain neurological conditions.
Yeah, like these are the ways we talk about using this technology normally, like acceptable reasons, right? The non-evil reasons you would muck around with someone's brain, right? But they use metal, electrodes into, neural tissue. But this, Jeremy, this new development, how does it incorporate living neurons as part of the implant?
Yeah, no, that's a great distinction there. This new brain implant device is really interesting because they're using those, soft, squishy living cells instead of just the hard electrodes.
Right.
The traditional brain implants, you're sticking those hard metal electrodes or wires into the brain. And, anytime you do that, that really just carries some risk of destroying brain tissue and causing some brain damage. There are some newer brain implants that try to take a less invasive approach. For example, they just sit on top of the brain, or they, sort of put them into like a blood vessel so it's adjacent to certain regions of the brain. But then you get this kind of trade-off situation where you don't have direct access to the brain and the neurons in the brain, and then that means it's harder to read the signals from them. That's that brings us to why they're this living cell brain implant device that was developed by the California-based Science Corporation, and that aims to sort of provide direct access to the brain in this less invasive way, while also harnessing living neurons that can form these natural connections with the host brain.
I was really excited when I heard about this because for years I've edited health stories where, you're talking about implants for Parkinson's, for example, and it's just like a classic thing that over time the brain sort of reacts to the electrodes and stops them from working. And it seems really clever then to actually use brain cells instead and sort of just kind of plug into the system that's there. How exactly did this sort of experiment go about doing that and achieving it?
Yeah, so for this very first experiment, the Science Corporation team, they basically first placed tens of thousands of neurons in these individual compartments, all kind of, arranged together in a single layer, effectively like a honeycomb array. And that honeycomb array of all these living cells is on the bottom of their brain implant device. And then they installed the brain implant device on the brains of living mice so that the implants neurons can kind of naturally grow out and connect with the neurons in the mice brains.
Wow. So it's mouse neurons into mouse brains, right? It's not like, because we did do a story, I think it was last year, where they put human neurons into a rat brain. So they're not doing that yet.
Yeah, you're right, Rowan. We're not talking about sticking human neurons into mice brains in this case.
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet. But to your point, I mean, that there have been previous experiments which have used human neurons and transplanted them into animal brains, and some labs even previously tried sort of effectively coating these silicon probes with cells and then sticking them into host brains. The nice thing then about what's happening now with the Science Corporation's device is that they're avoiding transplanting any neurons directly into the brain in sort of like that more invasive way by just keeping those neurons, again, in that sort of like honeycomb layer sitting on top of the host brain. And that design also really gives them some opportunities and more space to just put a lot more electrodes and other equipment around the implant's neurons instead of having to really jam all that into the brain space. One last important thing to mention is the Science Corporation team also engineered the neurons that are housed in this brain implant device so that they became light sensitive. And this was kind of part of their way of experimentally making sure that they could test the functional connection between the implant's neurons and the mice brain. So that's allowed them to run experiments which basically showed that the mice were able to respond to light signals that were activating that group of implant neurons. And again, sort of showing in this indirect functional way that they are connected.
Jeremy, when we're talking about animal experiments like this, I think it's important to think about what the endpoint is. What's the goal of this kind of research?
Yeah, because I looked on the website of the founder of the company, Max Hodak, and he said, "I believe that one of the essential goals of our generation is to understand the physics of consciousness and learn to engineer experience directly." Yeah.
Big goal there.
Yeah, so I think it's worth noting that we're just learning about this Science Corporation's experiment right now because they first did the demonstration several years ago. So since then, they've been kind of working toward this bigger goal of demonstrating how this kind of implant could eventually read the activity of thousands of individual neurons in a recipient animal's brain, and hopefully also potentially send signals to those individual neurons.
Wow.
And if the company can achieve that kind of control over individual neurons in the brain, then they think it's possible to start doing these wilder things like directly training certain patterns of activity into the brain. So, for example, one of the researchers told me about the example of maybe restoring the ability to speak to a stroke patient who had lost that brain function. But, as you noted with that statement from Max Hodak, you can maybe imagine some other wild possibilities when it comes to directly engineering a person's experience through their brain.
Learning to fly a helicopter.
Sure, download.
Yeah, exactly. And, talking of sci-fi, when I was reading about the story and you've been talking about Science Corporation, I was thinking, this is sounding familiar. And then I realized it's like the Tyrell Corporation from Blade Runner is the company in the movie that makes the replicants. And, that's maybe that's just me guessing it, but that was a bit weird.
I think that the naming there is quite a coincidence. I can see why you made that connection.
Yeah, maybe the lesson is we should just be really nice to anyone with engineered or an upgraded brains in general.
Thanks, Jeremy. In the magazine this week, we're reviewing the best of the year's TV and film, so we thought we'd invite Beth on to tell us about the highlights. Welcome. How's your TV year been?
Pretty good, I'd say. There's been some really good stuff. For me, I think probably the standouts were Fallout and Supercell, which I know that Rowan loves as well.
I don't know if you've seen Supercell, but it's like Heroes, but in South London. 5 ordinary people, all of them black, and all develop extraordinary powers.
Yeah, and I really want to see it because I've been reading about it, and the reason Supercell is in the New Scientist ballpark is that the people who have the superpowers, they all have relatives with sickle cell disease, which is a genetic disease, and as we know, it's more common in people with sub-Saharan African ancestry because it conveys some protection against malaria, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's got this really original premise, which is like a nice twist on the kind of genetically gifted superhero idea that you see in Heroes, as you say, and X-Men and all that. You also mentioned it's set in South London, which I really loved. I live in South London. That's really nice. It keeps it really grounded as well in like a recognisable reality. And it also has a lot to say about how black people are treated in kind of healthcare settings and how their care can be deprioritised and how they can be particularly vulnerable to abuse in such settings. So, it's a really, really fascinating show.
Yeah, and that point, you don't really normally get that in a Heroes movie, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It operates on all these different levels.
Yeah, great show.
And also, so earlier in the year, we also had Three Body Problem, which is a big New Scientist fan favourite.
Yes.
I don't want to spoil too much about it for people who haven't seen it, but it's essentially about this extraterrestrial threat to Earth and kind of how humanity has to come together to address this threat that, could unfold hundreds of years in the future. It's proper sci-fi, hard sci-fi, big physics, mad stuff.
Yeah,
really, really satisfying.
And as you say, big favourite amongst New Scientist staff. Really ambitious what the books do and what they've done in the show as well. And I think they did a pretty good job of it.
I think they did too. I think it's incredibly hard to adapt material and incredibly rarefied material that they've managed to make the changes necessary to make it a visual.
Well, it was the Game of Thrones guys, wasn't it?
It's the Game of Thrones guys and a guy called Alexander Wu.
Yeah.
And they've worked together and they've made something, I think, that is changed mostly really well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And is it, are they doing season 2 and so on, the other books?
They are. They're doing season 2 and season 3. So, fill your boots, basically.
Nice. I will.
So another show from later in the year that I was really surprised by was the second season of Silo. It's set sort of hundreds of years after this event has made the surface world of Earth too toxic for humans to live in. So they now live in this highly stratified society in this underground bunker. I was a bit of a kind of Silo hater, to be honest with you, from the previous season. I really didn't like it. I found it really smug and kind of quite self-satisfied. But it's such a big improvement in the second season, I think. And that's partly because they've got some good new additions to the cast. They've got Steve Zahn, who's really good in it. And also you get to see Rebecca Ferguson in kind of full Mission Impossible stunt woman mode, which is fantastic, particularly in the first episode of this new season. It's something's just clicked about it for me. So,
well, I really liked season 1. Actually,
okay.
Yeah. But so I do look forward to season 2 even more. Yeah.
Okay, great.
All right. What else?
So we might get into a slight argument about whether speculative fiction counts as sci-fi. I don't know, you on board with that?
We'll allow it.
I'll allow it, yeah,
Okay.
go for it.
Well, in which case, I really loved The Listeners. So it's about a secondary school teacher called Claire, who's played by another great Rebecca Hall. And she suddenly starts hearing this sort of low humming sound that there's no obvious kind of medical cause for. And then she eventually finds out that one of her students, Kyle, he's also hearing this hum. And from there, they're both sort of drawn into this community of other people who can hear them, the listeners, and it's not clear whether it's, you know, a supportive community for people experiencing like a health condition that is not recognised and not supported, or whether it's getting a bit sinister and culty. It's
intriguing.
Yeah, no, and obviously it's not, you know, hard sci-fi, but it is about this strange phenomenon, and it asks these kind of sciencey adjacent questions about like why do we seek out transcendent experiences? Like what compels us to look for community as well, and why we might be drawn into something like a cult.
It really made me think of, have you heard of the Bristol hum? There are apparently places where people think they hear a hum.
Yeah.
I wonder if that inspired it.
Yeah, no, so you do learn about why each of the people who hear the hum believe that what they think it is, and they've all got different theories, and they've all gone through phases of thinking one thing or thinking another thing. And yeah, it's a kind of litmus test for how you respond to something like that happening in your life, and how the people around you, and how that can just completely unravel ordinary relationships that you thought were solid.
Interesting, and perfect for Christmas.
Perfect for Christmas, yeah. It's full of dread, so enjoy.
Lovely. What about movies then for long holiday evenings?
I mean, the obvious standout is Dune Part 2, which I think, you know, it doesn't get more epic than that, obviously. I much preferred it to the first film, personally. I think it's just a more satisfying chapter to see Paul Atreides with the indigenous Fremen community of Arrakis. Yeah, it's just so overwhelming and epic, and it's got an amazing cast and some really good performances, particularly in this one. I thought Austin Butler was amazing in this one.
So you didn't like season 1 of Silo, but I did.
Yeah.
And you didn't like part 1 of Dune, but I did.
Okay,
So you liked it.
okay.
Yeah.
What's wrong with us? What's
I don't
happening?
know. We're incompatible.
You compliment each
Clearly.
other.
No, yeah, we compare.
That's nice.
But I like the planetary ecologist in the first.
That's true.
First Dune.
Yeah.
But in Dune 2, you know what? I've forgotten most of it. But there's one bit where Paul's mother drinks some magic water and gets the ability to talk to her unborn child. She's pregnant.
Wow.
It's
And
really cool.
The fetus kind of suddenly develops rapidly and can communicate telepathically with her mother.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, what else? Any other films we should be checking out?
I really loved, and perhaps this is controversial, I don't know, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I thought that was fantastic.
There's another one.
There's another one.
Yeah,
There's loads of them
absolutely
now.
lost track. How many are there?
I'm happy for them to do as many as they want.
But
I
why
think
do
they're
they all
brilliant.
go nasty? Because, like, can't we have bonobos taking over?
Yeah.
That would be nice, wouldn't
That
it?
I would like to see.
It wouldn't make for a very interesting film, maybe.
Well,
I don't know. You want
well.
conflict?
Maybe not a family-friendly
Yeah,
film.
definitely not. No.
Yeah.
So in this kind of twisty chronology of the apes cinematic universe that they've set up, there's a viral drug that sort of bestowed superior intelligence on kind of non-human apes. But it has this kind of deadly side effect that is ultimately leads to the kind of collapse of human civilization. And now this film is set many, many generations later. And now the apes are dominant across Earth, and they're kind of rediscovering human technology. And I don't know, I found a lot of moments in it very moving. There's this wonderful scene where the kind of main character, Noah, this chimp, he sort of stumbles across the kind of abandoned Griffith Observatory. And he looks into a telescope, and you don't see what he sees, but you just see his reaction to
Wow.
looking into space.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful. I nearly cried in the
Wow.
cinema looking at it. It's full of just delicate moments like that. It's probably not the best film in that franchise even, but I think it's full of gold like that.
It
I loved
sounds
it.
like worth watching it just for that scene.
Yeah, totally.
All right.
And if I could give like one more shout out
Go for it.
to The Substance. I don't know if you guys seen that.
So much buzz about this, isn't there?
Yeah, it's very divisive. And I think I would recommend that everyone see this. I didn't particularly like it, but I think it's so interesting, and it just simply must be watched. It's a body horror film about a woman called Elizabeth Sparkle, who's played by Demi Moore. And so she is an exercise instructor of some renown, and she is quite unceremoniously fired from her job when she turns 50 for various horrible ageist, misogynist reasons. In the aftermath of that, she decides to take this drug called the substance, which promises to kind of lead her to a younger, more beautiful version of herself, and that is Sue, who is played by Margaret Qualley, and just straight up bursts out of her back. And it's so gross, and there are lots of...
I didn't see that coming.
No.
Like Alien.
It's quite the twist.
Come back.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's really gross, so you should know that. So Sue takes over her life for kind of 7-day periods, and then Elizabeth gets to live her life. But it's about the kind of conflict that emerges between the two.
It sounds really clever and interesting, but body horror is just my least favourite genre of all.
It's like my favourite Penny. So, but yeah, I really like that the film exists, and I was frustrated by quite a lot of it. But it is the kind of film that you should go and see with friends, because it's. It's a film to argue about, and that's the kind of film.
You can gross out to it together.
Exactly.
After. Yeah.
It's a film to discuss, and that's what I like most about films. So
brilliant.
That's amazing. Thanks, Beth. Loads to catch up on over Christmas. And that's it for this week. Thanks to all our guests, and thanks to you for listening. Do tell your friends about us and give us 5-star ratings and a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen.
Yep, we'll be back next week. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Bye.